Okay, let's get some terminology under our belts. We need to know the difference to be able to distinguish between a stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. A stereotype is a cognition, meaning it's a belief, right? Cognition meaning thought processes. A stereotype is a belief. Specifically, believing that one has a particular trait or characteristic based solely on his or her group membership. Prejudice is an affect. What is affect in psychology? An emotion, right? So prejudice is an affect, meaning an emotion. Disliking someone based solely on his or her group membership. And then discrimination is an easy one because it is a behavior. Treating someone differently based solely on his or her group membership. All right, so let's practice these. You tell me which of the three this is. Carrie dislikes Jews. And the answer is prejudice. The key word there is dislikes, right? An affect, an emotion. The second one, George believes that Muslims are hostile. And that would be a stereotype. The key word there is hostile, which is a personality trait. Sharika thinks the elderly are forgetful. And that would also be a stereotype, the key word being forgetful, a trait. Bill hates lawyers. And that would be prejudice, an affect, an emotion, the key word there being hates. Tom avoids renting to African Americans. That is discrimination, a behavior. Barry thinks that women are incompetent. And that is a stereotype, the key word being incompetent, a trait. It is important to know how to distinguish between these for APA papers and class tests, including our test. But know that it is customary for ease of presentation to use the term prejudice as an umbrella term in lectures, research presentations, and discussions. Now here's the easiest terms you will ever likely be expected to learn. In-groups and out-groups. Groups we identify with are called our in-groups. Groups other than that are called our out-groups. Now that we got the rocket science out of the way, it used to be that racial prejudice was the norm. The norm. People would never even think to hide it. In fact, if they did, they would be questioned and looked down upon. This kind of in-your-face racism is called old-fashioned racism because times have changed. Now, there are still many old-fashioned racists out there, but they tend to only express it in limited circles. So now the norms have changed, another kind of racism exists. Modern racists are people who are racist but don't want to appear to be to others or even to themselves. Modern prejudice can be unconscious and is often disguised as political beliefs or doing your job, not just disguised to others, but often even to the self. In many ways, modern prejudice is more dangerous than old-fashioned prejudice because it is harder to identify and confront. And this brings us to questionnaire number 9. And this is your old-fashioned prejudice score. The mean for U.S. students is 20.3. 20.3. Now note that scores from the scale are likely deflated because of reluctance to admit. The midpoint on the scale is 45, so the self-report mean is significantly lower than that midpoint. In questionnaire number 10, this is your modern prejudice score. The mean for U.S. students is 29. 29. The midpoint, by the way, on this scale is 36, meaning this is 7 points lower than midpoint, down from 15 on the prior scale, indicating that people may be relatively more honest when taking this scale. Oftentimes, these two scales are used and suffice. In other words, researchers get enough variability to predict differences in behavior between high and low scorers. But as you may recall from our attitudes lecture, there are other, stronger ways to measure socially loaded attitudes like prejudice. Oftentimes, modern racists are not aware that they are racist. Here's a quote from a retired police officer speaking about the Amadou 41 shot case. Quote, "I don't believe the case was race-related at all. What makes it race-related? I tell you, being a police officer in a predominantly black neighborhood is not easy." End quote. Of course, he was not at all aware that in the same breath in which he declared that he was not a racist, he declared himself to be a racist. When the reporter confronted him about this, he still could not see it and responded, "I was just stating a fact." This stresses how modern racism is often unconscious and camouflaged. In one of many demonstrations of modern racism, social psychologists analyzed every pitch from 4 Major League Baseball seasons, 2004 to 2008, more than 3.5 million pitches in all. Umpires were more likely to call strikes for pitchers who were the same race or ethnicity as they were. Were they conscious of this? Every indication from their debriefing, surprise, disbelief, shame, wanting to learn how to avoid it, strongly indicated that they were not. So again, the tendency of modern racism to be unconscious makes it more dangerous in many ways than old-fashioned racism, because it makes it more difficult to identify and confront, not only in ourselves, but in others. This is just a review, but before we move on, remember self-report scales like the old-fashioned and modern racism ones often do suffice. But there are stronger ways to measure socially loaded attitudes when they do not. Do you recall from our attitudes lecture? One is implicit measures, which measures associations whether they're conscious or not, the IAT being the most prominent, and behavioral measures, which measure observable behavior. You may recall that we gave a behavioral example in that lecture too, something along this line. You could, for instance, set up a waiting area and precede a Confederate of a different ethnicity than your participants. Schedule participants one at a time and send them into this waiting area, assumably to wait to be called in for the study, and measure how many seats each participant chooses to sit away from the Confederate. In this example, there were 7 seats on each side, and the entrance was across from the Confederate. So each participant would likely have a score from 2 to 7, 2 being the least prejudice, 7 being the most. Why is it that most likely there would not be a participant having a score of 1? Okay, so you might remember from our interpersonal cognition lecture, personal space. If just looking at this picture, you can probably sense that it would feel uncomfortable to sit directly next to the young man. In fact, if somebody did, on which side would they most likely sit? Your left or your right? What do you think? And the answer is the right, because of the table in between. Okay, back to terminology. Sexism is referred to with slightly different terms because the modern form is characterized by benevolent, ambiguous emotions. Hostile sexists, like modern racists, are upfront about their belief that women are inferior to men. feel hostility towards women for gaining strength and honing in on what they believe are men's roles. Benevolent sexists believe that women are fragile, that they need to be protected and provided for and cherished like a china teacup. Both promote subordinate roles for women, discrimination, etc. Why is benevolent sexism often the most dangerous of the two? Like modern racism, it is harder to identify and confront. In fact, many women ascribe to benevolent sexist beliefs, not recognizing the harm. Okay, now that we have this terminology under our belts, this is where we'll be heading in this lecture. We're going to look at origins of prejudice. Where do little bigots come from? Babies are not born as little bigots. They do not enter the world as miniature gay bashers or cute tiny sexists. Where does prejudice come from? Who and what are the teachers of this foolishness? We're also going to look at effects on victims. Hey, ouch. Sure, it's degrading, tough on the self-esteem, but what other dirty deals are suffered by victims of prejudice? We're going to look at perpetuation. How does prejudice often persist in light of ample disconfirming evidence? Does it have a special coat of armor to protect it from logic? Or are we just idiots? Finally, we're going to look at ways to reduce prejudice. Enough already. What can we do to reduce prejudice?